Perth Linux Users Group, talking Linux and open source.
So it's kind of new, so this may suck, but maybe it will suck less than I think it might. It's basically going to be an extended Q&A session, obviously with Rusty, Dr. Chris McDonald from the Department of Computer Science, and Assistant Professor Robert Cunningham from the School of Law. So please make them feel welcome. Each of them have an area of extensive experience and knowledge, and I'm sure there's a large number of questions that we can come up with from across all kinds of things. I've got some leading questions as well, which we can go across. If nobody has any, I can see you've got one already. So let's kick off. Where shall we start? Should we start with some of my questions or some of your questions? Anyone?
You start with your question.
I'll start with mine. Let me start with this one. And this one came from Nick, I think. The first one, if it comes up. It's not a video recording of Nick at all. Let me just load up LibreOffice. That is precisely that.
This is Q&A.
This is Q&A. Yeah. Android as a platform. A discussion. There's been a lot of discussion on Android as a platform with regards to being a fork, a separate project, and the feedback it's had back into the open source community. Other people have probably got more questions that are pertinent on the subject. What is your thought on the whole Android environment?
I hate programming in Java, so I guess that's one of them.
Yeah, the fact that it's not open source means that it's not necessarily good for Linux. I mean, the fact that you can quite recently boot an Android device and not start the Java virtual machine, I think if that track continues and then people start writing in C or C++ or Objective-C or whatever they choose, I think then people might realise it's actually Linux rather than being hidden under all the Java layers.
But is the hidden good?
Is it good? Well,
is it good or is it bad? I mean, there's been such a mass market adoption. I think Android has now overtaken iPhone as a cell phone platform.
Oh, ages ago. But I mean, I've taken Android as a whole.
Yes.
But I mean, I run CyanogenMod on my phone, so I get my open source goodness mostly there, and I think it's a fantastic project. So I don't think you can say too much bad about what Google have done, and there's some nervousness about not open sourcing the one before ice cream sandwich, whatever it was, honeycomb,
yeah,
gingerbread, whichever one it was. That sort of made everyone do a double take because they thought they had understood how it would work, and then suddenly the rules changed. So people are not going to have unalloyed praise for it, but I've looked at the glibc source code. I have sympathies with somebody who wants to use something else. So, the fact that they're doing something different is not a reason to condemn them.
Anyone else from the audience got any input on this subject? Yeah?
yes,
I guess there is something to be said for the fact that I just bought an M9, and only after most of the Linux was stripped out did it actually become a mass market phone, as the marketing would imply. Is it more that, say, Android is trying to bring Linux or some derivative of the kernel plus Java, et cetera, or Dalvik, if we want to make the distinction for Google's lawsuit's sake? Is it really that we're trying to bring something to mass market that employs the underlying technologies, or is it we want Linux as a full stack? And what does a full stack really mean?
So we're getting into the GNU Linux versus Linux territory at this point. Everyone thought they knew what a Linux box was, but they didn't really anyway. It's just they didn't see them. All the embedded devices running Linux. Generally they use UCLibc and they look familiar, but there's always been that there. Now, we expected every Linux box with a user interface at least to look like something we knew, and this isn't. I find it really hard to get worked up about it. I think there is, complaining about openness on phones, for example, makes a lot of sense if you come from the PC world like most of us do. If you come from the console market, these things look awfully open, incredibly open. So, you know, it's nice that Linux is in the phone, but I think it's taught us an important lesson that is not the most important thing. You can probably still make a sucky phone, and you can probably still make a phone that isn't open in any sense and use Linux. So there may be a moral there.
Yes. Right back. Luke?
Given that several companies have taken Android as an opportunity to sue companies over what they're suggesting are patented parts of Linux which Android is using, how much of a threat do you think that poses to Linux as opposed to Android?
We're all gonna die.
I think it's about who's going to defend Linux. So if you've got big companies with big budgets and big lawyers, they've got a better chance of winning than just the moral ground that people are trying to take historically with Linux. We saw that with lots of open source cases in Germany, for example. People tried to take the high moral ground, but Siemens won or Samsung won or someone like that. And it's a battle of lawyers, not necessarily a battle of doing the right ethical thing.
The fact that we have defenders with money is part of the reason that why we have the lawsuits, though. So it's not, but for Linux will still be there. It's hard to see a world in which I personally will have to stop coding on Linux because of patents. It's theoretically possible, but we're not there yet. Will certain products have to stop using it? Perhaps, but we have had patent scares for at least 10 years now in various forms. And it's always been about the money. Yeah, we win some.
That actually brings us to another one. I'll just skip forward to where I was. It was that one, software patents. Now, I don't know if anyone saw the news today or a post today on the Linux Australia mailing list that the government is seeking submissions, deadline this Friday on, I think it was innovation patents, which is what's covering software, reducing it to an 8-year term instead of 20 years. The rest of the details you gentlemen probably know better than I do.
Well, I've got a question, which is how many people have heard of patent number 6,004,596 in the United States?
96.
Close. It's a patent that's incredibly important for sort of digital/computer policy debate. It's a patent for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And the reason I mention it is because it demonstrates the extent to which patents as a concept grow, and also the way in which they tend to operate in the name of vested interests. And I mean, if you think about patents, we have patent offices, but we don't really have anti-patent offices as such. And I guess from my perspective, that's the role that I see for open source. It may not necessarily be anti-patent per se, but still, if you think about the public domain as a broad notion, then anything that can facilitate that public domain, I think, is an important project. And personally, that's why I'm interested in open source. It's not, I was saying to Rusty during the break, it's not necessarily about, communism versus capitalism, or it's not, the dichotomy is not that neat. But still, I think that anything that does facilitate corroboration is something that should be supported. So, in my view, the intellectual property system has a long history of representing concentrated interests. And if we think about the TRIPS agreement of the World Trade Organization, well, that's really cemented that concept. And so software patents are really just the next progression. It's the next sort of peanut butter and jelly sandwich, if you like, in the technological realm. But
who holds that patent?
Well, there is a footnote to that, which it has been recently revoked. So, so it is a bit of a cop out in that sense. But the point is, it was actually, it did exist. for several years, and that's just one of, I could quote many examples. We could also talk about, the general concept of patenting algorithms or plants or whatever the case might be. But the trend is the same, which is this continual expansion, which doesn't necessarily make sense in the information domain, to continually extend property, because most people would know about the tragedy of the commons, but then of course on the flip side of that we have the tragedy of the anti-commons, which is to say that if too many things are owned, then it stifles innovation. And probably preaching to the converted in that sense, but
we're also seeing a limited number of cases where people will put a patent on things to simply prevent other people putting a patent on things. So for those of you that read Slashdot, I think there was an interesting story 2 weeks ago where IBM have patented, I can't say that word, a routing algorithm. So much like Google Maps, for example, you could say, I want to go from point A to point B, but because the page you're viewing is being sponsored by Walmart or Burger King or something like that, the route delivered to you is suboptimal because it will just happen to drive past Walmart or drive past Burger King. And IBM patented this, first of all, as a silly idea, but also to prevent other people from actually getting it. Because if Navin or Garmin or someone like that, ends up with these things in their devices, we won't actually know what algorithm is being used, but we might see Walmart a lot, which would be a bit strange in Australia. It's a long way to travel to Walmart. Never mind.
Definitely suboptimal.
So maybe maybe we'll see more patents. People will just say, well, we don't really have a choice. We have to put a patent on things to prevent people from preventing us from using it.
So yeah, the concept of going further, the concept of like a GPL patent thing. The problem is that the barriers to patents are still significant. It's a lot more than copyright, which you just get. How hard you try to shake it off, it's there. Patents, you actually need to talk to a lawyer. And so there's a couple of things. One is that when it comes down to it, patents cover the specific thing that is listed in the patent. Now, some of them are broadly general and everything else, but in a lot of cases, it is way more specific than if you just read the title of the patent. And it only covers, if it says 4 brightly coloured people in a red car, that only covers in a red car, not a yellow car. It's really, really specific. And when you get down to it, often you just, the problems are either easy to work around or you didn't actually, you didn't infringe in the first place. So a lot of these patents are really, really specific. On the other hand, there are so many of them for that reason. You look at any modern device, you're talking about at least 1,000 patents potentially involved. It's just gotten ridiculous.
And the microphone.
Aren't we facing a problem with free trade agreements where we have to respect other countries' patents? And with the Americans having such a broken patent system, and we have to respect their patents, broken or not.
We don't actually really need to respect. So the Americans have a broken patent system, but remember the software patents started here in Australia. Because we're seen as even easier in some senses in the US. So we shouldn't be throwing stones at that one. Certainly from a policy point of view, it would be refreshing if we took a U-turn and we started saying, patents are an incredibly powerful force when they are heavily restricted. If you really think that we need these monopolies to move forward, then the same way that having a ball game where all the kids get a ball doesn't work, we should be aiming for the highest bar possible. If you could, putting aside whether it's a good idea to have patents at all, if you said that Australia was the hardest country to get patents in, if our laws or our patentability was a subset of everyone else's, and so you could say if you get a patent in Australia, you get a patent anywhere, people might actually try to get patents in Australia first because it would be worth something to investors. We are not headed in that direction. We're headed the other way, which is patents good, more patents better. Therefore, you lower the bars, give patents out to everyone. And that's definitely the trend that we're seeing. There's a bit of a kickback on that, but it's not clear that it's severe enough to certainly change it into a direction that would be more sensible for us.
Just despite the last couple of things you just said, I just wonder if, to step back a bit, perhaps the only practical defence is a patent portfolio or the backing of a major player like IBM with a patent portfolio.
So that anyone being sued by intellectual ventures.
Yes. The problem is the patent trolls. Non-practicing entities. Anyone who doesn't actually sell anything is very hard to cross-license. And this has a number of large companies fairly worried. And I'm actually not going to go into that. I don't know what IBM's internal position on that, but I can probably make some educated guesses. So that's part of the problem. The rise of the patent trolls has meant it's no longer, even somebody producing stuff trying to make sure that, say they stop Samsung from shipping their products. This is now about just shaking everyone down. Now, in a way, we don't care. Because if you don't have any money, they don't come after you. So a lot of free software projects get you to just completely ignore this whole issue. A lot more than some proprietary projects have to worry about it. But yeah, for certain high profile projects, there's significant money involved, and that brings us all back to us. And yeah, potentially building up our own portfolios is one way of going, but it doesn't help the ones that we're really scared about.
I was just going to say, if you think about software as being a language, which, as I was saying to Rusty during the break, I certainly think of it as that because I hardly understood a word that was said while I was here, which comforted me because I do tell my students that software is a language. But if you think about a language in that sense, and then you think about the concept of owning that language, or that the language can be owned, it's sort of, if you're being really philosophical about it, imagine if the English government said that every time you speak English that you've got to pay the English government some money. Most people laugh at that concept, yet if we think about software as being the language that allows human beings to interface with computers, I think there's a really interesting philosophical question there about the ownership of that language and whether or not it is something that should be owned as a basic precept. Maybe, obviously the train's already left the station in that respect, in that, we can't wind back the clock, but I still think it's an important thought to bear in mind as we sort of, progress. Should language be owned? Whether it is copyright or patent or any other.
Drawing a parallel on other recent news, similar, that it's like art. Art is owned either by the artist who made it or by the people who appreciate it once it's in public circulation. And I know that at least one director who made a small film called Star Wars has recently been in trouble from making more edits and changing the fact that the original copy probably won't be available in 25 years' time, only the most recent copy with a lot more edits, and that's upset a lot of people because it's not the original artwork. So the appreciation of the object and the appreciation of the language, potentially that is owned by the people who use it, and the stewardship is by the maintainer.
Yeah, even the word property in intellectual property is a bit of a misnomer in a way. It's quite sneaky that the word property ended up coming a part of the intellectual property regime, because if you think about physical land and then think which is property, real property, and then you think about information, they have very different characteristics. For a start, information, as you all know, is non-rival and non-exclusive, so it means that we can both use the information at the same time. It's not like an apple or something where if I eat the apple, you can't eat the apple. If I have the information and you've got the information, we can both use it at the same time. So in that sense, it's information is fundamentally different to physical objects, yet somehow we've translated the law over and pretended that information is the same as a physical object. And it's not. So.
The parallel I was like that
one. Sorry, can I just with the point you just made there, would you agree with the statement that intellectual property is a conspiracy against the public in that it doesn't represent the constituency?
I certainly think that you can't divorce intellectual property from what I would call corporate capitalism as opposed to free market capitalism. So in other words, the system is geared towards benefiting the traditional owners of intellectual property rights, which tend to be highly concentrated. So in that sense, I think, whether we call it a conspiracy or not, is another question. I mean, basically, it's just the natural consequence of a system that benefits vested interests. Is that a conspiracy, or is that just the nature of history? I'm not sure.
So tempted to go down this rat hole, but
The parallel I've heard drawn with that one is if it is classified as property, then you should pay stamp duty every time it's moved.
We should add a Tobin tax onto that as well, maybe.
Just a completely different question. Is there a solution to the current SSL certificate schmozzle that's going on with all the browsers?
okay. My network security days are a long way behind me. You know, systems that are kind of broken actually work remarkably well for an awfully long period of time. And it's one of those kind of broken, we're kind of working around it maybe kind of thing that... Is it fixable? Not perhaps in a pure sense, but it hasn't been fixable so far, and it's been working reasonably well. So, you know, I tend not to get too apocalyptic when you get things like this. But, you know, you need to have, in any imperfect system, you need to have these mini crises in order to get any improvement. So perhaps we're seeing one of those. So optimistic in the long term, but yeah. I'm not going to go into all the technical stuff, but do that offline.
I've got a security question then. Would you have a prop for? Not that prop. So this has been one of the things on the Linux Australia mailing list quite a bit. Not specifically looking like this. Secured booting. In the UEFI kernel or operating firmware. Oh no. Your thoughts on that? I mean, obviously the media jumped on it. I'm guessing they've got a few journos subscribed to the Linux Australia mailing list, and suddenly everyone in Australia who's on the Linux Australia mailing list is taking Microsoft to court. But that was probably jumping the gun a little bit. What's your thoughts on the whole secure boot environment and the rights of the OEM manufacturers to either include or enable or disable the ability to turn on this secure booting feature?
I don't mind that they have or exercise rights to have it or turn it on, because we have rights to not buy their hardware. I mean, the whole issue when it becomes exclusive or, you know, 100% of hardware has it, then we've got a problem. And then maybe it's over to you. Maybe you're attacking with monopoly laws or something like that. We don't have to turn it into a technical issue. So I do believe, you know, the discussion has been worthwhile, but I think people have jumped on it early. And to sue a company for enabling something that's been there for several years, but they haven't actually done it yet, seems a bit premature.
You're wincing.
Awfully hard to buy a machine without Windows still.
Indeed.
Yes, and you've got to pay extra for the privilege of not having Windows on.
That's right. Well, when you can't, you know, so it's not an overreach to say that it will become extremely difficult to buy a machine, even with Windows, that you can run something else on. That is concerning, and I think that's a real concern. I think there's a whole area about the encroachment of intellectual property regimes over physical property that we can go into here that we're not going to.
Who owns the device at the end of the day?
Who owns the device? I mean, you know, keys are a really good idea. On the assumption that the person who owns the car also owns the keys. The concept that, you know, car locks would have been, you know, invented and promoted, and yet on the assumption that the person who sold you the car would hold the keys, that wouldn't have flown. Now, obviously there are efforts underway to address this kind of thing, or nip it in the bud before it actually happens, and I was, you know, I don't know if I'm supposed to be waving in that direction,
No,
but...
right. Yeah. So for the guys that remember, I work for Canonical, and one of my projects at the moment is figuring out what we're going to do about secure boot. I think, as you said, Rusty, the big concern is that while theoretically you will have a choice about not buying a machine that's locked down, in practical senses you can't buy it like a non-Windows machine at the moment, or it's very difficult to. So it's going to be very difficult to find a non-locked down machine that, well, for example, you're going to buy a machine that's compatible with Windows 8, and to be compatible with Windows 8, the manufacturer is required to enable secure boot by default. So it's more of a practicality thing rather than a strict requirement to not be able to boot anything but Windows. But the mitigating factor there I see is that it's not going to be in the OEM's interests or the hardware manufacturer's interests to completely lock down a machine to a point that where you can't boot anything. And as I guess the anecdote goes, the biggest competitor to Windows, to any version of Windows, is the version of Windows before it, and that includes Windows 7. So it'll be quite a while before we see any machines that will only ever boot the current version of Windows, because there is a long lag in there. So that gives us some time to prepare and do what we need to do to get Linux in a good place. But it is very concerning.
Do you not think it's feasible then that a certain Redmond-based company would underwrite the OEMs or the equipment manufacturers? To
Without a doubt.
Turn it on?
They do already. That's why they.
Yeah. But it's the user is always the person with the money. So if every large corporation wants to run Windows 8, then maybe they have a case. But we know that people are still running XP, people are still running Vista now, and it just won't be practical to mandate that today everyone runs Windows 8 and only does that. So there's a bit of leeway there, and I think we're going to come up with some recommendations fairly soon. There's nothing surprising in that, but our aims in doing that is to basically provide a decent way around this problem, and I think that's going to be workable. There'll be some obstacles still, but we're hoping that the OEMs will cooperate and we'll have basically a continued Linux ecosystem.
Given their dominance in the market, there are antitrust issues if they decide to push this button, I think.
You don't see that going away in the cell phone industry.
That's interesting because Apple's still not capable of locking down their devices. Right? So I say that as a card-carrying Apple device holder, right? They can't do it. What makes you think anyone else is going to be successful? There are 10 million, there's so many more hackers out there than the security guys trying to lock this stuff down.
That's
if they try and stop us,
they don't
we're
care.
going to get through it.
They don't care about it.
Yeah,
that's exactly the
I
point.
fully understand that the security FI problem.
Because in this case, if you have to basically do something really, really hacky in order to install Debian or whatever, it won't stop us. I mean, this is your argument. Yeah, we can still buy machines that don't have that problem. That, however, see, I don't care about the rest of you. I want to run my operating system. The problem is that if none of the rest of you do, it gets a lot harder for me to do that. We've been here before. You can't get drivers for things because nobody cares about you because you don't have market share. If the island shrinks below a certain size, it gets really hard to live. And that's the only reason I care about everyone else's market share.
We will always be able to run Linux on our machine, but we have the knowledge, we have the abilities, the tools to circumvent whatever. It'll be the Apple thing, the HTC thing, whatever it is. But the problem is making it usable, making it so that you're off the street, you can grab a CD, run Ubuntu, and install it. That's the big issue. That's what we're concerned about. And not necessarily Ubuntu with anything, with FreeBSD, with Debian. It's not an ecosystem that we want to have just one or two players in it. It needs to be global, it needs to be accessible, and it needs to work.
And that's even without the whole philosophical issue of owning what you paid for.
Yeah.
Anyone else on this topic? Yeah?
If I may, this may be a controversial jump, but if we were to talk about the cloud and in terms of how you'd never own a thing, in terms of using services rather than just having hardware that you just have limited rights to, how do we try and limit the scope of that infringing, say, people's rights to choosing OSs on the cloud, seeing as that would be a service, and that's very much a case of, well, this is what we provide you, build it and they will come.
Change of provider.
But unfortunately, cloud works on scale, and so it naturally tends towards a monopoly of perhaps a handful. And again, you're in on the, I can build my own cloud if I want to run what I want.
So you're saying we've had tiny little clouds all these years and we never realised?
That's right.
Single user.
And I think it's quite a worrying development in the sense that that the information that will be used through that cloud operating system or cloud software. I mean, let's say Google is doing that with Google Docs or whatever. I mean, ultimately the documents that are being used within that operating system become the intellectual property to some extent of Google, or at least Google has a licensing arrangement by virtue of you using that software that means that they have the license to use the document that you're reading essentially through that program. So I'm personally very concerned about that development.
And that's even before they start handing across your information to the US government because you supported WikiLeaks.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Can I say I teach a lot of students under 20, and I could probably make a blanket statement, not one of them cares. Okay, so UWA hosts its student email through Google in the United States. The students are given an opportunity to opt out of having Google storing their mail, and I was only told today, I don't quite believe it, but not a single student has opted out of that. We've got 22,000 students, they just don't care. And, we've heard lots of people, I think Bill Joy was the first one to say, privacy's gone, get over it. Here's a question.
Where did they publicise that?
Oh, didn't you find that little web page hidden somewhere?
Small break.
I actually wanted to ask the same question. I wanted to say, okay, well, no one's opted out, but is that because no one could find out how to opt out? And, opting out might be as simple as providing a forwarding email address, but does your email go to Google before it gets forwarded? There's a few caveats there. But I would say for a lot of issues, students under 20 who, in 5 years' time are going to start employing other students under 20, don't care as much about privacy. Facebook's done a lot towards that. They don't care about DRM so much. They don't care about privacy so much.
When I was 20, I didn't care about my privacy either.
No.
I've done some things.
I've seen pictures.
So I agree, it's something we might worry about, but I think it's...
As a student, the switch to Google was a fairly dramatic increase in quality of service, but more than that, I wasn't actually aware that you could opt out.
I'm not responsible for opting in or out, but so it was introduced over a Christmas break, and of course students arrive back at the end of February for the next term, and this is how email works. And there's Google Apps, and they work fairly well. So, it's a trade-off for privacy issues versus convenience and ease and quality of service. I had a small delegation of international students, I won't be more specific than that, but came to see me in November before the switchover, and they were very concerned for political and maybe ethnic reasons, that their email was going to sit in the United States and their home country wasn't the best friends with the United States at the moment. They made a big noise about it to me. I talked to the guild president, I talked to the director of student services at UWA, but come February the next year, even though a lot of the students came back, they didn't come back with their concerns. They just sort of either given up or didn't think it was worthwhile pursuing anymore. So, Chris?
In terms of Google, I hate to point anything out about Google. They're nice guys, but they do have some issues in terms of using data. One that very few people ever think about is, aside from, say, us hosting student mail on the Google Apps services, is that they do go and seek through your emails. So they do active content searching on practically everything to do with your life. So just where is it people will draw the line if the whole of their life, as much as an email will tell you, is searched through on a day-to-day basis and metadata is taken out of that?
As long as they get better ads, it'll be all okay. Would you rather targeted ads or random ads that you're not interested in? I mean, you've got to pick one.
Targeted ads, but they need to stop when you bought the product.
That's better targeting is what you're arguing for.
It's better targeting.
Because Gmail will notice that you've bought it already, and they'll send you something else.
Ad for the upgrade.
That's right. Yeah.
So you were just saying this about people under 20 not worrying. I actually work for a Australian government, federal government department, and we have a social networking, rose a couple of years ago, several years ago, and it was decided we would have something internal about this, and it's actually quite good, but I subscribed to it and then did a couple of trace routes. It's hosted in California. And this is an Australian government department, and I've pointed this out to several people who've said, yeah, we know about that, but, or we're trying to do something about it, or we might bring it in if we think it's necessary. So it's not just people under 20, it's most people don't seem to care.
Should that be that the Australian federal government should actually be employing Australians here in Australia? As part
Well,
of
it's
its
partly
operation?
that, but I doubt that Agimo, I don't know if you know Agimo knows about it. I would be surprised if they knew about it and would let it continue, to be honest.
Talking about keeping things within your jurisdiction, there was an interesting situation a couple of years back in the UK where a large number of local councils took their funds, your council dollars, and invested it in Iceland, and all that money disappeared, and rubbish bin collections stopped in various places because the money's gone. Whereas if you keep things within your local domain, then at least you've got control over it, and that comes back to the whole cloud versus local debate.
I think with privacy, it's a lot like we're going through a huge phase of security as well, of looking at security and thinking that, oh my God, we've put all this data in these computer things, and oh my God, they're not as secure as I thought they were. It's not like the films. Like there's a lot of people, executive level people out there who are suddenly realizing that their systems are actually vulnerable and they do actually need to start spending money. And I think the point at which people start caring about privacy and caring about security is the point at which they actually lose money or are affected in a negative way, a dramatic negative way. Like the first time we see like wide-scale deaths, like the first time we see some sort of serial killer that's using mined Google data to kill people or something like that. Now, you might laugh and say, oh my God, that's an outrage. It's not that outrageous. You get a bad Google employee who's got access to the data, he goes a little bit bonkers, he takes the data and starts doing something with it. You know, and that's the stuff you can see, because of course the other thing that the security guys are saying is, you know, there's all this stuff you can see, all the Sony hack and blah, 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 blah. But for many, many years, there have been lots of little things going on where, like mining companies in Australia have been compromised by Chinese hackers. So they know exactly what it costs us to deliver a ton of iron ore. So they know exactly what to bid on it. And that's been going on for a very, very long time. But no one's been made aware of it.
Sparky.
Where does he get his tinfoil hats from?
Yeah, I think we've rapidly moved to the point where, certainly with respect to cloud services, we no longer can build the whole stack ourselves. I was observing this fact the other day when I wanted to run a particular app. There's a great web version of the app out there. Can't find anything equivalent that's free or open source that I can actually host on my own server. If you zoom back 15 years, 1995, everybody could run your send mails, your email clients, the Pines of the world, your web service, your Apache. You'd be running the same software that your major ISP was running. Now, zoom for 15 years, you can't do that anymore. Or you can do it less. You can't do it to the same standard.
There's two things here. One is unlike us, who might be considered us, most people don't run their own office. See, the difference between the university having my email and Google having my email, as you say, more reliable, probably more secure. Definitely, let's be honest, definitely more secure at Google. So, win-win. Because for most people, it's not the choice of me having it versus the cloud having it. It's that random person having it versus that random person having it. And of course, they're going to choose on the basis of whatever's cheapest. The issue is, I'm happy to pay for cloud services the same way I'm happy to pay for someone to administer my machine, or pre-install Ubuntu or whatever.
I use Google spam filtering.
Yeah, there you go. It's concerning though when you're getting it for free, because as everyone says, if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, you're the product. And that is where we're starting to see there's some sort of worrying lines that get crossed at that point. And I think when you combine it with security threats, people may start to get aware of it because they realise how much stuff that they're not so concerned when it's all within Google's walls. But as soon as it escapes for some reason and gets used in a bad way, they might start to care. But we've seen that in the past. People still don't care about the security of the internet. So, we keep thinking that it'll get bad enough that will fix the security problems in our computers. It hasn't happened yet. We've been saying it 15 years at least. So, maybe people will start to care, or maybe they'll just live with it. And they go, at least I'm getting, free spam filtering?
I figure since we've been downplaying the cloud, down talking it the whole time just now, I figure I should play devil's advocate at least. I remember a talk by an Israeli private investigator of all people, and he was speaking with his thick Californian accent about how people have all sorts of information just from day-to-day sources, the government with paperwork, all sorts of sources just as you go and live your daily life. Without computers, those sorts of things can be, collated, on-sold, third-party, whatnot. And he came up with some really strange examples like VW data mining and figuring out the people with a preference for crunchy peanut butter, like a certain model, and Smooth prefer the other one, the hatchback or whatever it was. And that was such a strong correlation, and yet they found this, over tens and tens of millions of people. So is it really that it's computers, or is it the legal process in terms of where our information goes?
I think there's the archivable aspect of it as well. So it's there's the micro and the macro issues here. I mean, on the one hand, you might get a better service as far as the email goes with the UWA email example, but when you times that across the entire planet and you then have Google siphoning off all of that information that would have been held by hundreds and hundreds of different universities, for example, and then it's all collated into the one place, and not just collated but also archivable. That's where I think the dangers lie. So yeah, data mining isn't a new concept. It's been going on forever and a day, but it's the concentration that worries me.
James. Promise to give it back to James.
Yeah. Just in response to that, at what point should you care what data they are taking? Because obviously, does it really matter that, say, VW knows what flavour of peanut paste that you like? And surely there could be some good things that come out of that, like they can design cars for people who like crunchy peanut paste. So yeah, at what point should we care?
I think you can start to get concerned about it if it actually comes back to bite you. So I think you mentioned you're a UWA student. So do you use Turnitin, or does your faculty require to use Turnitin? Okay, so Turnitin, for everyone, is a piece of software that universities buy licenses for, and students have to submit their essays to this piece of software, and the software will come back and say, I think you've plagiarised part of your essay from some data that the Turnitin group has in their database. Now you think, well, where did the Turnitin group get their data from? And they got it from millions of students worldwide submitting stuff and keeping a copy of it. So students have to submit, can I call it intellectual property?
Yeah.
They have to submit their intellectual property. A company that is profiting from you as a student having to contribute your intellectual property and keeping it, then tells you, I'm afraid your essay looks like one written by someone with your name who wrote it last year because they had to turn their assignment in last year. So if things come back and bite you in that way, I think that's when we start to worry about these things a bit.
Yeah, so I guess I work on a lot of network services in my job, but I've always found, and I found sort of cloud computing to actually be quite useful in a lot of the stuff we do, in that you sort of no longer have to manage individual servers and everything, but often the trade-off I've often found is that for a lot of these platforms, you end up programming against one particular cloud platform, such as Amazon's system or Google's system or everything, which often means that your applications can't easily port between the systems. So, I mean, do you think we're probably going to get to a point where you sort of get standardized, and we standardize on one of these systems and actually get application portability? And how important do you reckon that is going to be for the industry?
Once a year, the New York Times produces a specific technical issue with a full centerfold without a staple, and it's got big bubbles that represent the size of technical corporations. And if you think about it, if you think of the fact, there's Amazon and eBay and all this, there is one Amazon, there is one eBay, there is one Facebook now that MySpace has been pushed aside. So most of the big things, just call them things casually, are pushing aside or buying up the smaller things, and as a consequence we're ending up with all these small monopolies. So I would suggest that the problem will sort of go away because you might only be having to program against one type of cloud service.
Perfect.
Exactly. Thank you.
Move on.
Thank you, Bill Gates.
Cloud certainly seems like any infrastructure seems to scale reasonably well. And so when you're talking about cloud, you may well be talking about one of those industries that goes to the winner takes all model. In which case, yes, it'll solve that problem and create others.
Create others. Yeah.
But things like OpenStack are an effort to standard on provider standard. Maybe that will gain some traction.
Everyone with the top layer always likes standards. And so it always comes down to the market dynamics of how that works.
And we invoked the name of Bill Gates there, but I think probably the one we would, and rest his soul, Steve Jobs and his ecosystem. Yeah, rest his soul. His ecosystem has, well, let's face it, that same mentality. If there is an app for that and pretty much one app, after you've culled all the other Twitter apps, you know you've only got the one. And worryingly, they're starting to, as with Windows and Azure, they're starting to move to the cloud. And seeing the way the App Store model and its distribution and your ability to actually push things on, seeing as, you know, Steve's maybe not liked things about him, if it's an app about him personally, or, you know, certain subcultures within society, or, you know, certain, there's various, you know, reasons apps have been refused, which are a bit more controversial. So when we, rather than having an app store, we have everything in the cloud, you can't root that device. Is that even more worrying? Because people like us, technical folk, if we do, you know, succumb to the temptation of the cloud, suddenly we've been trapped.
I think most people will say, does it matter? So do you think many people care that they can't even service their own car today? They prefer the convenience of taking it to an expert to service their car.
Could you find an expert? I just have people who replace
Well,
parts.
yeah, not necessarily an expert. Someone that's willing to take your money. Yeah, let's call it that. And maybe computing is the same way. People, I think, just become comfortable with the convenience, the always-on nature of things, the availability of things. They won't care, I think, you know, what operating system their data is stored with. I don't think anyone cares that now. So I think it's just a trade-off. I mean, we talked about security briefly before. You know, security is just risk mitigation, and, you know, DRM is just risk mitigation against the property that you might lose. So it's all a balance. There's never complete ownership or complete lack of a walled environment, or whatever you want to call it, I think. What do you think? What do your parents think?
My parents, as you can imagine, don't really care. They stick to, you know, Facebook and all their lovely-dovely, you know, apps and websites. I guess that is one of the things. As you say, it's a very personal thing when it becomes personal. Aside from that, it's people don't even know. They wouldn't have a clue where to begin in terms of these issues. When it comes to something like, if it becomes very much a financial motive that you would have to go to the cloud and use something like Windows Azure, and as was mentioned before, you just can't use the stack yourself, you can't implement everything. If you have to go and say take SQL Server and all these other services from Windows Azure or whatever cloud service you're using, eventually it becomes a case where it's impossible for you to say, I don't know, use Richard Stallman and this GNU operating system, as he likes to call it. It just becomes impossible that you could, you know, say use the GCC tools and whatnot for yourself.
I mean, I've got a confession to make, I guess, at this point. I became a lawyer because I wanted to be rich and powerful, and if I had my choice again, I would become a computer programmer, I think, or a coder, if I sort of could wind back the clock 10 years. Because I think the reason I say that is because, in a sense, and this is a point that Lawrence Lessig, who some of you I'm sure would have come across, basically says that code is law. And if you start thinking about code as law, then we would want to make sure that the law that governs us is what underpins that law is some sort of democratic process. And the thing that I think about is that if we don't teach our children, for example, how to code, then they will just grow up thinking, well, you know, I just use that thing and I don't need to worry what's in the black box like you do with your car. And to me, that's a really negative trend, because if code is law, and I believe it is, then it should be democratised and people should be able to do it. And when we move away from a situation where we can't have any influence over that code, and I think the cloud sort of notion fits into that, then it's an anti-democratic trend in some respects, because you just have this black box and that controls the way in which you engage with the piece of technology that you're engaging with.
There's a couple of things that I want to, a couple of threads in there that I want to pick up on. One is, I don't know if you have to worry about Microsoft Azure or Windows Azure, because as we may or may not remember, Microsoft's really good at creating their own enemies when they own the market by overcharging and causing people to want to move out. The other thing is that if technology companies move to the point at which no one can learn to program, no one will learn to program and they won't have any employees. So there always has to be a way. It's like everyone, like when the App Store came out on Mac, there was a lot of discussion about they're going to lock that down.
Won't they just train their own employees? Why would you?
Two societies.
Yeah.
The
Why
Morlocks
waste
and
your 3
Eloy.
years at university learning your program when you can go straight to?
Goes back to the old guild system.
Yep.
Facebook's not even run by people now, it's run by computers that escalate to the humanness eventually. So when does it become a case of systems that grow and grow and grow and can't even something out of it?
Well, the stock market's the same. I mean, you've got in New York now, you've got 70% of trades being done by algorithms. You know, high frequency algorithm trading. So
Yeah, but so it's the humans who do the embezzling, and until they
by writing algorithms.
Through algorithms, yeah.
Madoff versus Deep Blue.
But what they'll lose, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of the guys high up, because at least at Microsoft, Google, and Apple, a lot of those high up guys started in the garage. They know that the guys who are going to do the best for them are the people that desperately want to program. They need to do this. And the best way to get them is to let the systems, at least to a certain extent, be open. We're going to have some closed and some open. The future is in the middle. Like, there'll be some things that will be... that's not to say, you know, we should be pushing against security FI or anything like that. That's absolutely a fight that is worth having, and making sure that we can continue to do this. But it is not in their best interest for it to go all the way in one direction.
I like your thinking that they would leave money on the table because it was not in their best interest to lock things down. No, I'm not. It's just not. Nobody plans that far in advance. Nobody's like, if we do this, the next generation of people might not grow up learning to code, and we may have next quarter. If it's beyond next quarter, that kind of thinking is just not.
What led you to believe that Microsoft acts in its own best interest?
In terms of getting employees, because I've seen how they do the recruitment, and at that level, they're actually quite functional. It's just the way they silo their company and a lot of other things that they do is just like you'd think someone would have thought through, but no one was thinking.
But sufficiently large companies don't recruit people based on their immediate abilities. They might recruit them on their problem-solving abilities or their communication skills or something like that. But once they get to Microsoft, Microsoft will teach them how to program.
There are plenty of industries that hire people without, like,
yeah,
the
without hard skills.
programming.
IBM is the biggest defender.
Nobody has learned how to do Windows kernel programming until you get into Microsoft. That's right.
Yeah.
But the two people I know who got hired by Microsoft, both of them, one of them was hired directly out of high school and he kind of vanished and we never saw him again. But anyway, but he was hired on the strength of a thesis he was writing involving programming. And the other one did a research paper, again in programming, on, I can't even remember, it was something to do with image analysis, and he was on their mapping team until that all fell on a heap. But in both cases, neither of them would have learned to do the thing that they did that caused them to be hired by Microsoft without an open system to write code on. Okay, so I have anecdotal evidence that this is actually how they do it because I've seen it happen in two specific instances.
2 data points.
Yeah.
Okay.
Plural of anecdote is.
Oh, okay. 2 points make a line. So.
A question from an online viewer here, Dave Mason. One of the things we're losing from the cloud-style system is the ownership of your system. Your mechanic's not going to take your car away if you stop paying them $20 a month. Is there a way so the cloud services can be more of a one-off cost than a rental, or is it realistic to have cloud services that degrade more gracefully when the user wants to move away or can't afford to pay?
Oh, I go. Yes. I was going to say, having a service which goes on perpetually is like perpetual motion. If it's a service, then there's a cost to doing a service, I'd say.
What if your gravesite says rented? I've got to pay for that for eternity, and how long that is.
100 years, isn't it?
No,
20?
No, it's very long.
25.
You get a gravesite.
Maybe cloud services will start to pay for them. I mean, at the moment, we're paying for them by the minute or the hour or the month or something like that. Maybe when they become more commodity, we'll pay for them as we do ISPs. You actually sign up for 24 months, and that gives you guarantee, hopefully, that the company is going to exist for 24 months. And it also gives the company a revenue stream for 24 months that's going to avail them of not bailing out immediately.
Amazon EC2 does that at the moment. You can choose either pay-as-you-go or 1 year, 3 year terms. And
yep.
I think portability and replication are fixable.
So with reference to the being able to cut someone off from their services, do you see there sort of being a need to maybe legalise this, where there are certain services now, like electricity and water and stuff, which are an absolute requirement for existence, that maybe some of the service should be made a legal requirement that you can't cut people off because, being in touch or being able to receive emergency warnings and that sort of stuff becomes part of the cloud service.
We seem to be headed the other way with 3 strikes laws and things like that, rather than heading towards it being a compulsory service. It's an interesting idea, but I don't think we're there yet, where you would view your internet connection or your certain online services as being a human right kind of level. Maybe in 20 years' time.
With most cloud services, I sort of see it as a commoditisation of a problem. Like email used to be something you spent a lot of time on. Now you can just go, I can get it from Google. Is that really going to cover everything you do with a computer? I don't think that I can see the cloud taking over everything. I guess that's where I'm pondering about the cloud services.
Well, logically, with enough bandwidth, you're just holding the monitor and keyboard.
But I suppose that's when the desktop becomes a commodity problem. Is that something we're ever going to get to?
Online's doing it. I mean, for console gaming, that's arguably a hard real-time system where responsiveness is paramount. If somebody presses forward on their joystick and it gets lost in the system, they're not going to pay for your subscription service anymore. And online is doing really, really well in the United States. Sucks to be us, because we of course can't play on online servers in the United States because of the tyranny of physics. But it works there, and gaming is arguably one of the most high bandwidth, high response time, low response time systems we have that we use computers to do. I'm not saying trading systems are obviously much more. There's many more hard real-time systems, but in terms of something that a user is actually interacting with a computer and requires a response immediately for the illusion of continuity or whatever. And it seems like that's a solved problem now, which is,
That's still a commodity problem. That's still a small set. Okay, this is what you get. It doesn't really have the breadth of what you can do. You get a service which covers a small subset of what they give you, rather than what you may actually want. That's sort of what I'm seeing it.
I think that covers a lot of what people actually use their machines for.
Yeah.
it's a surprisingly small subset. I mean, let's just say that like tablets don't make sense to me because computers for me are input devices, not output devices. So anything that makes it slower to type doesn't make sense. But I realise I am unusual. Other people seem to enjoy these things. So.
I'm going to say last question, and I've got a few quick things I want to go through and want to wrap up.
So I guess on the whole topic of cloud computing, one of the, reasons for this whole ecosystem is because corporations are always acting in their best interest, and it's in their best interest to have control over everything that happens. I find it really, I often have this conversation with people I know and explaining to them why it's a bad idea and why it might be a good idea to have control of the data yourself. But it can be hard to make that argument with people that just don't care. So do you have similar conversations with people, and what do you say to make the argument against cloud computing?
I've never had that conversation.
Just say that.
I tell people I work in a bar if they don't know what I do, because they're not going to ask any hard questions. So yeah, I've never had that conversation with random people.
Cool. All right.
I mean, I've had that conversation just today, but very briefly, and I think I've already made the point. But my concern basically stems from the leverage that whoever's running that computing gets from you using it, and I am genuinely concerned about that and the legalities of it, because generally speaking, the law or the licensing system that you are using by virtue of engaging with that service is stacked against you, because you're one small player, and it's the concentrated interest which is operating the cloud. So I mean, I'd be interested to know if there are any open source cloud initiatives, or whether that's counter.
Eucalyptus, isn't it?
Because I guess the point is, it doesn't have cloud. If I understand it correctly, it doesn't mean that it has to be a concentrated interest. It could be, a democratic sort of, or there could be all sorts of ways in which a cloud could be constructed.
Yeah, and I think we've got a long play on this. There's a lot to go before this shakes out. We may well end up with a very benevolent kind of system where you don't think about it so much as you think about your electricity or phone providers, and some of the issues that you get with those.
When users don't care, it's hard because there's no vested interest for them to try and be open about things. If the consumers are happy to just be using all Google's services without caring that means Google has all of their data, then what can you do? It's just naturally, maybe that's the way it's going to go.
I definitely think that's where we're headed. I think, as I said before, my students don't care, and they're the next group coming up. I teach a unit. I don't know if I teach it, I give it. I get paid for it. It's called Security and Privacy, and the security stuff is interesting, and people can latch on to ideas and dabble with some simple technology. But the privacy side of it, whatever, no one cares. It's really hard in tutorials to discuss some things. Why do you want to keep your data private? And so, articles like, again, Slashdot recently announced, FBI's new project starting next year to identify individuals in video footage from CCTV cameras and so on. And so there's a double-edged sword. Let's say you put a photo into the cloud, for example. There's one issue as to whether or not you can be identified in there, but you've perhaps also given away some privacy of those people who are also in the photo. And, this is an issue we could sit here and debate, but again, I think 20-year-olds just don't care, Here's a photo of me, the fact that there's other people in the background, that doesn't matter.
It's hard when you think it does care, and try and explain that to someone that doesn't care, and it's like, it does matter or something. I don't know, maybe it doesn't if no one cares.
I've always thought the simple solution is to declare the internet a completely separate national entity.
Secede the internet.
Yes, secede the entire internet get a seat at the UN.
Facebook has just registered a political party in the US.
Wow.
So what does that mean with an election coming up next year?
And the amount of influence that they have, direct and indirect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of quick questions I was going to go through.
Sorry, was that?
How do you use Lightning?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things I wanted to go through. Big news in Australia, the National Broadband Network. What role do you think open source in the ecosystem is going to have in light of the NBN rollout? Any? None?
It's an interesting question. I often wonder about the role of hardware in open source, because I once had this idea that open source became widespread in the way that it has because people had access to, or widespread access to hardware. But then it hasn't been that linear, has it, the progression of open source? Because in a way, if you go back to, say, the 70s, it was sort of certain aspects of it, well, at least, well, maybe it wasn't called open source, but it was that same sort of model. So it's so at one point I thought that in order for an open source project to work, you'd have to have a critical mass of people having access to hardware. But then thinking about what happened in the 70s with computer software development, I've become confused about that issue. So I don't know if you folk have any comments on the role of hardware in open source production in any shape or form. Like, does it need to be widespread, or does it just matter who's got access to it?
I think hardware will become free. I think you'll go up to a phone box. I know we don't have phone boxes anymore, but there'll just be bits of computers and bits of hardware lying around all over the place. And you will authenticate with your cloud service wherever you are. You won't care what the hardware is. You'll be pissed off that the keyboard they've given you to use is uncomfortable or something like that, but you won't care.
Yeah, and there's certainly an argument for just putting computers in everything because it makes them uncopyable. It's certainly protected by copyright law for free. So now you've got your object that can't just be manufactured by someone else. So yeah, ubiquity. There's certain trends towards that. Just have them everywhere.
Cool. Hottest open source technology in the next 6 months. What do you predict is the biggest thing that's about to happen, now happening, and CCAN. Absolutely.
We're totally on that part of the curve, and it's just, I projected it goes like that.
Anyone else got any ideas? Yeah.
There's a lot of research being done in the area of encryption, known as homomorphic encryption, which is a type of encryption where you can actually compute without decrypting it. So you can do like in voting machines, you can actually add up the votes without ever decrypting the data. I think with the increase in cloud computing, homomorphic encryption actually allows you to retain your data, because the cloud providers can actually do it and do cloud for you and store it without actually having access to the data.
There's a long way to go though. We can only do it addition and negation.
Yeah. 6 months is
so we've got to restructure every view we have of Turing's world into addition and negation, and then we're away. So I'd give it another few decades yet.
I'm looking at the open source project. I'm coming a bit closer to home that I'm sort of excited about. I'm gonna go out there. Predictions are really hard to make, especially about the future. But I'm going to say that CyanogenMod is going to see some big moves in the next 6 to 12 months.
It's got support from Samsung now, hasn't it? The developers have been.
Samsung hired one of the was it Samsung who hired the main developer? So I think we're going to see some. I think if that doesn't kill the project, it'll make it stronger. And I think we'll see a lot more people actually running their own stuff on their phones. Because we've got perfectly capable Android phones out there.
Was this Tizen?
No. CyanogenMod, the main alternate aftermarket firmware based on Android. It's an open source project, and they're probably hitting critical mass now. They've got over 500,000 users. They're getting to the point where they're as big as a small phone vendor. That creates some interesting possibilities. If they continue to ramp upwards, more and more people are running their CyanogenMod on their phones, it's potentially quite disruptive, and some really interesting stuff can happen at a certain point when people get interested in it, as in people other than the geeks running on their phones. So I'd go out there. And the other technology I think is interesting, but I wouldn't know, I'd put a 6-month on it, would be Bitcoin. Bitcoin, I think, is, we've seen that bit now to fund against. Especially, when you're looking at a country like Australia where we basically pay a lot in transaction costs, I think there's potentially a great deal of upside in Bitcoin or something like it coming along. So that's another open source project I'm cautiously optimistic.
Blogging about.
Yes. Someone actually tipped me in Bitcoin the other day.
50 bit cents?
Sorry?
Was it the 50
Yes,
bit cents?
okay, there you go. Right. How did I know they'd be in the room? Okay.
Excellent. All right. Well, we should probably wrap up. It's been about an hour and a quarter or so we've been doing that for. Did everyone enjoy having the extra chat? Again, thank you very much for coming to Perth and also for giving us the cash to do this all again one day, soon, hopefully. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to the AV team who've been slaving together a recording of this, which will be on the Plug website in the next couple of days. We have a meeting next month for Daniel talking about open source hardware. I'm going to tentatively say we'll probably be at Artifactory. Yeah, fine. Which is in Osborne Park. For those that don't know about Artifactory, it is
Unit 8, 16 Guthrie Street.
The Perth hacker space. So it's basically a warehouse with lots of really loud equipment that you can play with.
With that also inclusion.
With that also, yeah.
The adults at the Artifactory aren't so much adults.
No. Hopefully everyone's got one of the notebooks. Please take all these spare ones. These were given to us by IBM when they came along to our Plug in the Pub session 2 weeks ago. I don't want you left over because I've got to take them home again. That's it. Thank you everyone for coming and we'll see you next month.